Okay, we are back for Chapter 2 lecture. Chapter 2, I focus on etiological models. So what that means are the models for the causes of the disorder. So what do we think causes mental illness in our current day? And so you can see here that I have them divided under psychological, biological, and then more encompassing one, biopsychosocial. So let's start with the psychological causes. We have 4 of them. And we're going to see these models come up over and over again as we go through the different chapters and we say, okay, what causes depression? What causes schizophrenia? So that's why we need an overview of them right now. So we start with psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. While they mean slightly different things, consider them the same thing for this particular class. Basically, that is a Freudian theory. So anything that has to do with Freud or has to do with sort of parental behaviors or attachments or anything like that, we're going to consider that psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. Second one is behavioral. Behavioral really focuses on learning. And so behavioral models suggest that some of the behaviors that you have or the symptoms you have for your mental illness are really learned behaviors. And so we focus on classical conditioning. So you're probably familiar with it. Think about the little Albert study. Phobias are really strongly classically conditioned often. We think about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is about rewards and punishments. We'll see that come up quite a bit with depression. And then also vicarious conditioning, or learning by watching somebody else. And so anxiety sometimes is considered vicariously conditioned. So we'll see these behavioral models come up over and over again. The cognitive models really look at perspective. So anytime that the issue is how you think about things or your perspective of things, I can't always talk and spell at the same time. So the way that you structure your thinking is considered a cognitive etiological model. We'll see that come up again for depression and others. We'll also see a blend of cognitive and behavioral. That's a very common treatment, and so the etiology is considered a blend of the two of them. Finally, sociocultural. This looks at any kind of demographic variable or the fact that your culture itself is a part of why you have the mental illness. We'll really see this come out when we talk about eating disorders. But the other thing that we're going to see a lot is gender. So in your textbook, you'll hear a lot about how gender impacts the rates of disorders or impacts sort of how people get these disorders. Those are sociocultural models. All right, next we have the biological models. We have 5 of them. The first one is the neurotransmitter model. It's not really a model necessarily, but whenever you think of somebody taking medication in order to deal with their illness, we're probably looking at that medication treating your neurotransmitters in your brain. So that's a neurotransmitter etiological model. So that something's going on with your neurotransmitters, too little or too much. Morphology means structure. So whenever you think about morphology, think about structure. So you'll see in each of the chapters talking about how different structures in the brain are shaped differently. So if it's shaping differently, smaller ventricles, larger ventricles, larger amygdala, that's a morphological model. A functional model says that the parts of your brain are working differently. So they're shaped the same, but they're working in a different way. We'll see functional models more than we'll see morphological models. Finally, behavioral, or the last 2 are genetics. Behavioral genetics looks at your family history. So if somebody says, well, your mom had depression, so you are at a higher risk for depression, that's behavioral genetics. Nobody actually took your blood, nobody actually looked at your DNA, they're just looking at family history. That's behavioral genetics. Molecular genetics, though, actually looks at your genes. They take your blood, they look at your DNA and say, we found this gene which may be related to this disorder. There's a lot of research going on in molecular genetics, but it's still a long way away from us ever being able to say, you have this gene, therefore you're probably going to have this mental illness. That's unlikely to actually ever happen. So these are the 2 genetics. We use behavioral genetics much more, but molecular genetics more and more is getting some research. Finally, as I've mentioned before, there's sort of a blend of all of these, which is what we call the biopsychosocial model. So it says that your biology might give you some risk factors. So because you have a history of depression in your family, or because you have certain genes, or because your brain is shaped or works a certain way, maybe there's a risk factor for an illness. Psychological looks at these first three components. So maybe the way that you think about things, maybe the history of trauma that you've had in your life, or the way you've learned how to get attention, that's factoring in. And finally, the social really is the social cultural component of it. And so it's saying your environment, or the experiences that you've had, or the fact that you're a female in the society, or that you're African American in society, or whatever, is also playing a role. The culture plays a role in terms of how this mental illness comes about. So a biopsychosocial model takes all three of these into account. And the ending result usually is that this is a stronger etiological model. Usually there's a blend of these. It's very rare that you'll ever hear anybody say there's one thing that's causing a mental illness. Usually it's a blend of all of these combined. So make sure you take some time to remember your biology, your biology of the brain, your biology of neurons, and think about sort of how each of these models gives us an etiology or a cause, and how they might work together, because we're going to see that over and over again in all of the mental illness chapters. Finally, chapter 2 talks a little bit about research methods, so make sure you take a peek at that. There's 3 different levels: individual, group, and epidemiological, which is basically patterns within a population. So that's how we research abnormal psychology. We can look at just individuals with case studies, we can look at groups and do actual experiments or correlational experiments, and then also we look at the patterns within the population. That's it for chapter 2.